that I feel like he always was like poking around for the broken places and for people. And then it's like when he finds one, he kind of goes deep. And that used to annoy me a little bit. Although when I first found it, I was like in love with it because I was going through kind of a hard time myself. And it felt like it was all comedians, all in recovery. And their lives made so much sense after like this kind of weird world of journalism where jobs churn out so quickly. And then I felt like it got like so, I felt like, oh no, he's doing so much about himself. Like the broken places were all like a mirror for his own broken places. And now I feel
Mhm.
like he's matured and come out on the other side where he's a genuinely excellent interviewer and he's got more control over where it goes. And when he does expose himself to be reflective with people. So he's great.
That is such an interesting comment because it's such a fine line, and it's going to be different for all of us and different depending on the project of how much do we include ourselves? What is the role of the interviewer? And a lot of brand new interviewers to audio believe that their role is just to provide a platform. Like, I'm so modest that I'm not going to include myself at all. And there's this saying, they might come for the topic, but they stay for the host. People want us to be there as a presence. And then you've got to figure out where that line is, according to your audience and the project and all of that. So I think that's a really interesting thing. It sounds like he did this sort of. Carrie, yeah. Anybody else reflections on what you just heard from Mark Maron? Yay or nay? Something you liked, dislike? Anne?
I quite like the way, taking on from that, the emotional side of things, but going beyond the obvious and picking away at it, and setting that intimate tone where you are uncovering something that that you can't find out from somewhere else, that it evolves out of the conversation. Um, everybody wants, well, not every, but getting that intimacy within, especially within audio, makes such a difference, and that does work both ways. To your point, Elaine, the interviewer has to enter into that area, into that sphere as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Um, and you said something that we haven't touched on yet, but and won't too much with this, but is really, really important, which is what are you creating that only you can create? And if you have that question in mind as you interview, only you or maybe your organization, depending on what you do for a living, um, you're bringing something, hopefully, that nobody else is, that's going to make your show, your article, your whatever unique. And it's worthwhile to think about that as you craft your questions and you do your research and you choose your guests or your sources. You choose the angle of the story. It's going to change the way you write that interview up front. Let me reshare one more time. Okay, so I used to start it right here. Why are we here? And basically, I do feel like, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, interviews are the foundation of all great stories, conversations, everything we do. And we probably have all gotten home from an interview, looked at our notes or listened to the tape and gone, oh no, I don't have I don't have what I need. And then you don't have a foundation for your house, the story, the article, the show. And so it crumbles. And so of course, what we're really looking for is an interview that, or several interviews, whatever we're gathering, that's so solid and also is interesting. There's lots of entrances, details, it's inviting, so it's just a philosophy of the way I look at things, is that there's so much work to do before we ever get to writing, cutting tape, doing, creating a show in post-production, whatever we're doing, even if it's a straight interview show, in order to make that solid foundation and deliver something good to our audience. There are a lot of things that trip us up in doing interviews. Here are a few of mine. And if you want to jump in and say, well, my biggest trip up is blah, blah, blah. So I think the biggest one is being unclear on the goal of the interview. Why are we doing it in the first place? What is the purpose of it? Without knowing that, you don't know what to ask. You don't even know how to prepare. The more public the person is who you're interviewing, the harder it is, because the more material there is. So what's your angle? Why are you choosing that person as a source or a guest? Lack of preparation is another bugaboo of mine. There's a lot of, with the millions of podcasts that are out there now, and blog posts and whatever, there are a lot of people who just launch in, like whatever I think is good. I can get on a mic and just talk and it'll be great. Lack of preparation is huge. Being unclear about who the audience is, who your ideal audience member is, one person, what they want to know. Asking Googleable questions. How many of us have heard, so where were you born? Or tell me about your job. You're a copywriter, right? That's not an interview. Talking points. I think this is really a huge problem right now, is we are not checking public figures on what they have to say. Misinformation, disinformation is enormous. We really do need to come to most of our interviews with a lot of knowledge. Long-winded interviewee, we will get to this. How do you actually interrupt purposefully in a way that actually can serve the guest as well as serving your audience? The lying subject, not much more needs to be said. And again, being unclear about how much of yourself to bring to the conversation. Those are just some of the things that trip us up. Anybody have any big trip ups that they worry about, that they run into, that they've done? Yeah. You don't even need to raise your hand. You can just shout out, unless it starts to get, enough that I need to moderate.
Sometimes interviewing a guest that I perceive is more talented, important, than me, that puts me in a place of, it puts me on the back foot. It makes me nervous. And when I'm nervous, I don't listen actively. And yeah, it affects my ability to converse,
Sure, being intimidated. That is a tough one. Who has an antidote for that nervousness or intimidation? Anybody?
I don't know if I have an antidote to it, but if I'm interviewing people that make me nervous, I try to kind of put on a persona, or both put on a persona, but also just kind of model the type of conversation that I want to have with them. So being friendly, making sure I'm smiling, kind of throw a couple of jokes, or like do a little bit of self-deprecation, just like I might ask the question twice because I mumble sometimes, so like to kind of put a little bit of that nervousness out there. And then when it's externalized, it kind of goes away a little bit, when that kind of humanizes the moment that we can share together. So I don't know, that was like 3 answers in one, but it's a little bit of how I approach that.
No, I like it. I like it. Anybody else? Sometimes I think about like, well, they haven't always been who they are now, right? And we have such a predilection for judging our insides by somebody else's outsides. And so like, so they're a big name now, but who were they? How did they get there? Like they were us once, right? But it's, and I think the other thing is just repetition. You just do as much of it as you possibly can. And after a while, it's not so bad, but also having a purpose. I'll tell you a quick story. So years ago, I was just starting to do podcasts. I was hired by an organization in Denver, and they wanted a podcast, and they knew the guests they wanted. They wanted these big guests, but they didn't know why they were doing it. And I was so new at this that I didn't push back hard enough, and I got thrown into a joint interview with the governor of Colorado and the U.S. ambassador from Colombia. And I think I had just gotten the contract like 2 weeks before, if that. So I spent like 3 days trying to bone up on what the ambassador from Colombia might have to say, but I still didn't know what they wanted. Well, that's a world of, I mean, how much could you possibly ask either one of those people and put them together? And so there I was, brand new to the whole podcasting world, no purpose. And the governor of Colorado at the time was John Hickenlooper. It is very difficult to say Hickenlooper when you're nervous. And I knew him. I had interviewed him before in a different situation. And I just stumbled over my words. That was a terrible interview. They both were trying to make me feel better. And I felt like this, And so I think if you know what your purpose is, the thing that you're really after, that would have helped me enormously. And I was just sort of wandering around in the dark. I could have asked a million questions. And ultimately, I didn't wind up with anything particularly useful. I don't know if that's helpful. Anybody else have a trip up that, that's your thin ice? Okay. Let me move on to 10 techniques to improving things. And we're going to do a little exercise because the very first thing that we usually need to do is to create rapport. And so I'm going to stop sharing in a minute, and then I'm going to put you in breakout rooms if you're okay with this. Everybody okay with doing a paired exercise? And this language comes from a woman named Emma Cortland, who used to be the host of a Gimlet show called Crime Show. It was sort of a very different take on true crime show. She was superb. And she's an oral historian. And so I asked her, like, what's different about the way oral historians approach interviews than the way journalists do? And she told me about this. Tell me a story about how you got your name, or tell me the story of how you got your name. And I said, oh, tell me how you got your name. And she said, no, 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 no. Tell me the story of how you got your name. Because when you do that, people will tell you a story. But if you just say, how did you get your name? They won't. And it's something simple. It's something most people can tell some sort of a story about, or it engenders something. It puts them in storytelling mode and it just relaxes people. And you want to start with something that is low trust to high trust. So you're just getting there. You're not going to say, so instantly, in her case, tell me about the day you found out that your loved one was murdered, right? You can't start there. You have to start with something that people don't mind sharing. And so I want you to use those words. Tell me a story about a moment in your life that led you to being here today in this webinar. And just take a few notes. And what you're going to do, we're not going to go back and forth. One person will be the interviewer and one person will be the interviewee. We're not going to swap it after because we don't have time. So pick one person to ask the questions and the other person to answer. And I want the interviewer to just take a few notes, because afterwards I'll ask for a couple of volunteers and have you tell the story that you heard. Everybody got that? Okay, great. And let me see if I can get you into Zoom rooms. Okay, where to go? Forgive me, I used to have somebody who did this for me. Breakout rooms, here we go. And I'm going to assign these automatically, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I'm going to try to. No, sorry. Let me do this again. Not doing it automatically. Ah, okay. I'm so sorry. It used to just automatically do this.
Hi, Elaine. We're all in one room.
That's what I worried about.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
I could help you with this part if you want to. Like,
Would you?
yeah.
Yeah. Can I make you co-host? It's
Yeah,
just
why don't you go ahead and make me
totally,
co-host? Yeah, and I
it's
can do.
different than it used to be.
Yeah, it is. They keep moving
Yeah.
around, so.
I sure wish they wouldn't do that. Sorry about that, guys. Carrie is gonna take over and do the technical.
Okay, so Phil while I
for-
figure it
for
out. So
me. Yeah. They've changed it. Zoom has changed this. I apologize. We've got a couple of new people here who just joined. Let's see. Dr. Brown, or should I call you Carrie?
Carrie is fine. Hello. Sorry, I was
Hi.
a little late post-election meetings.
And not a problem. And where are you joining us from?
I am joining from Orlando, Florida.
I will be there on Sunday, actually. Going
Great.
down to work with your public radio station down there.
Okay.
And what do you do, Carrie? What prompted your interest in interviewing skills?
I own my own consultancy and I'll be starting a podcast really soon.
Oh, good. That's great. That's great. And I think Christina Duff, you joined us a little late too. Where are you joining us from?
I'm from Greenville, South Carolina.
Great.
3
Nice.
years here from California.
From California. Oh, that's a big change.
Yeah.
Terrific. Carrie, how's it going? Are you ready yet?
yep, gonna open the rooms. Here we go. It's
Thank
very
you.
done by random, and I'm gonna jump
Okay.
in a room that has 2 other people. So here we go.
Okay. And just 5 minutes.
Yep. Okay.
I popped back. Hello.
Hi there.
Sorry, I jumped out quickly, and sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. No, that's I really enjoyed our conversation, Adam. Thank you. It was
Yeah, thanks.
super interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. People usually love this exercise because it somehow elicits a different kind of an answer than if you just said, "So what brings you here?"
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
it's always interesting, isn't it? You're hearing about somebody else's life and ways of working and yeah, and what's going on. You know, I love it. You know, we're all very curious, aren't we, about finding out these things, and it's a great question to uncover a little bit more than the obvious. Yeah.
great. That's great. Okay, I'm gonna just close that. Carrie, thank you for saving me from
Anytime,
myself.
Elaine.
I appreciate that. So what I'd like to do now is, by the way, can you still see am I still, I was shared, but I guess I'm not shared anymore.
You're
The
still
screen.
shared. Yeah,
Oh,
you're still
oh,
shared.
really?
It's actually,
Oh,
yeah, you're not in present mode, but you are still shared.
Oh, great, of course. Well, we'll just put it back in present mode. No, we won't. Because then I can't see you. Who wants to volunteer? I think we have time for about probably 2 people and you'll need the permission of your partner. So just, make sure, just wave, say, "Hey, Christina, is it okay if I tell your story?" Whatever. Who wants to share as interviewer what you heard? Christina, you'll need to unmute.
I interviewed Lori March, and I heard her say that she, in the industry, was interviewing and always had a director. And she always wanted to sideline and ask her own questions and kind of bump the director out of the way. So now she has her own project and gets to be her own director, creative director, and interviewer. And she's really excited about it.
That's great. And Laurie, how accurate was Christina?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate. Yeah.
Is there anything she missed?
Possibly, but nothing like massive. I think there's like little nuance or detail or something that, but I feel like I didn't do a super good job of storytelling. So I think she did a great job of making it sound better.
Well, here's my other question. How does it feel to hear your story told back to you?
Oh, it's cool. It's definitely cool. Having someone encapsulate something, especially because mine did not come out especially tidy. It was like I had to scratch my head for a minute or two to get started. I think it was the story part that threw me. Telling someone something is different than like, tell me a story about
Right.
that actually did throw me for a second. But yeah, it's neat to hear somebody tell you what you said, I guess.
Yeah, I hear your story back to you. Who else wants to go ahead and tell us? Yeah, Ella. Who was your partner? Who was your partner?
So I was in the room with Kerry and Madeline, and Kerry was observing us, and maybe Kerry could chip in. But Madeline, are you happy for me to talk about what we talked about? I think Madeline is incredibly courageous because she shared a very personal story. I was the interviewer, and when I asked Madeline why, what moment brought her to this place, and she said that she's been an addict, a drug addict, and she's now in recovery. She spent a year as an addict, and she dropped out of college and journalism because of that. But what is amazing is this journey she's been on to bring herself back from that. I said I was completely dumbfounded when she came out with that initial reason, because I thought it was something to do with her father, and you've mentioned that you have this connection, Elaine and Madeline's dad, but it turns out Madeline's father is a huge supporter of her, and he's really helped her on her journey back to health and recovery. And this is an ongoing process. She doesn't believe it. She's got some quite controversial views in some respects. I mean, as a young person who's lived through experimentation and growing up, part of it just seems like normal young adult risk-taking behavior. But so I was curious. I mean, I could talk to Madeline on this subject way more. The time ran out, and it's like I've got so many questions about it. I think what's really impressive now is she's educating other people, or she wants to get into that sort of educating people on the health risks and on the actual facts and some of the solutions that she sees that she can bring to the table now she's had this experience.
Wow. Well, that was quite a conversation that, imagine this is your very first question that you've asked beyond, how are you doing? Thanks for being here. What's the weather like where you are? And now you're launching into, well, tell me a little story about your name or about why you're here or why you agreed to do this interview, It's really interesting. Maddie, what was it about that question that gave you a feeling of permission, or maybe you will always feel that sense of permission to tell your personal story?
I'm very open about my personal story, even in my interviews, if I'm interviewing someone about drug addiction, just because I feel like it creates a rapport, it creates this bond between. And I always want to be open about my own struggles in case someone else is struggling with those, because it opens the room up for conversation. And I thought Ella did a really great job at making me feel comfortable in the interview. She asked me a couple times if I was okay with this being shared, and I totally am. But it's just nice to know that I have a choice in what's shared and what's not.
That is so important. I have a choice in what's shared and what's not. And we'll get into that a little bit about setting ground rules for an interview. An interview with somebody is a little bit of a negotiation up front. So I think that's really important. I'd love to hear how other people have reacted to hearing this story in response to essentially a question that says, what brings you here today to learn interviewing skills? Anybody have what feelings did that elicit in you? Or possibilities did it elicit in you for your own interviewing going forward?
If I could just add one more thing about that conversation, it's just that because it was so disarming, Maddie coming in with that, such a personal, to many people would want to hide that. There'd be a sense of perhaps of shame or of disappointment or something, something negative. But because Maddie was so open, all of a sudden I was free to be open, and that freed me up, because if it was me in this situation, would I dare to share that story? Probably not. I'd bury it and hide it and try and pretend it never happened, kind of thing. But when somebody else opens up, all of a sudden I feel free. I feel liberated as an individual and as a human being, and I can share something a bit more deep and meaningful about my life, which perhaps I wouldn't have done ordinarily.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Maddie, you did us all a service. And that's, it's a service that, like, say that's on a podcast, that is doing a service for listeners who you may never hear from, but it might change their life in some way. Most interviewees are not that courageous. And so, like, I think, we talk about curiosity and empathy and things like that as being important characteristics and skills for an interviewer. But I think courage is also very important. And deciding where the line is for yourself. And also, is your personal, whatever your personal story is it serving the listener in that, or the audience in that particular project that you're working on? Sometimes it may be important to establish rapport, but it may be not useful to the listener. It's irrelevant. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But absolutely, Ronald Young Jr., I have a sound judgment episode with Ronald Young Jr. Carrie, have you met Ronald? So he is an award-winning podcaster who did a series called Wait For It, about the experience of being, I forget how he says it. I don't know if he says being fat, or if I think he does, about fatness in America. And it's incredibly well done. It's emotional, it's funny, it goes with a range of emotions, and it's very courageous. And he does a lot of trainings about that very thing about vulnerability. And if what we're going for is an emotional truth, then we need to grapple with how vulnerable we are choosing to be. And again, the appropriateness of the vulnerability for lots of different reasons. So excellent. Well, let's move on to the next piece of it. And you're going to see once again that I am not in present mode yet. All right, so you're seeing what you should be seeing, I assume, at this point. Okay, so I'm just going to go through, there are basically 10 points here. I'll give some more weight than others. I've written a whole essay about the interviewer as leader, and this gets back to what I was saying before, that a lot of new podcasters in particular feel like their role is simply to, I've got you, some big guest or important or whatever, someone I feel is more important than I am, and that I'm serving this guest up to my listeners. Now here I'm only talking about the actual interview that you may present to listeners, as opposed to interviews that you're using as sources for stories, for narrated stories and so forth, or articles. That there's a misconception that you just fade into the background, that you are certain, are there just as a platform, and you're going to let the guest guide the conversation. And first of all, guests don't want to guide a conversation. They don't know what you want. They don't know what your listeners want. They may not have ever even listened to your podcast, etc. There's all kinds of reasons why, if you just say something, which I hear a lot, well, tell me about yourself or introduce yourself, that they don't know how to answer. And then you get this sort of wandery, rambly thing, and it's, a pretty big turnoff. So I believe that an interviewer is a leader just as much as, say, a panel moderator, a good one, is a leader. You're deciding the destination of this conversation, and the best interviewers serve as informed guides for their audience. And they're poking in corners that the audience can't. And they're building a narrative arc, right? So an interview is a conversation with a destination in mind. So you've got to know your purpose. We're going to get in a second into creating a narrative structure for your questions. You have to prepare your source or your guest up front, which may include pre-interviews or auditioning your subject. But even if it doesn't, for some reason, you may need to establish in a journalistic interview, on the record, off the record, or on background. Is everybody familiar with those terms? I actually can't see if everybody is nodding yes.
I don't know what on background means.
Yes.
Well,
what is that?
Yeah. On background is something that you're probably never going to run into unless you do investigative reporting. And that is, deep throat, right? It's somebody who says, well, you can use the information only to get more information. You basically cannot use this at all in what you produce, but it will lead you to, you're going to have to report more to find evidence of what I am telling you. So, on the record is obvious. Off the record is, you can use this information, but you can't use me as the source. And sometimes we're going to negotiate that, like the 13th Step is a Pulitzer finalist series about sexual assault. And they certainly allowed, the reporter and the editor, they certainly allowed some victims to not identify themselves because they didn't want to do additional harm to those folks, but they did want the stories that were important. So you're going to negotiate that for the most part, though, unless you're doing investigative work, everything's going to be on the record. But you do want to state that up front, that basically, I'm interviewing you, Maddie. Everything you tell me is on the record. So if you don't want it to appear in public somewhere, just don't tell me, right? Unless if, Maddie, you say, well, there's some stuff I would like to tell you, but I'd like it to be off the record. Can we discuss what that is? And then maybe negotiate it. So that's setting some ground rules up front. I would encourage you to think about what your values are. There are increasing numbers of journalists and podcasters who are going, well, what are the values that we're going to bake into our show about how we treat guests and sources? And that's a whole discussion that we don't have time for, but you might want to take a look. I think Death, Sex, and Money might have a whole presentation about their value system and how it shows up, how they were very conscious about it. It was a lot of work to do. Consider power dynamics. Almost always you have more power than the person you're talking to, just by virtue of being the interviewer. Not always, though. Like, as Ella was saying, like you talk to somebody with a big name and now you're nervous, they've got more power than you. We're not going to get into that again. You could do a whole presentation on ethics and power dynamics. But if you are going to interview people who have suffered any kind of trauma, I would encourage you to go look at the DART site, D-A-R-T. That's a whole training site for interviewing, for trauma-informed interviews. And I imagine that Carrie probably has some good stuff to say about trauma-informed interviews as well. And then the last thing is maintain control of the conversation. I have a few other things to say about this before I move out of the way here, move along.
Elaine, can I make one suggestion that has helped me in that part about maintaining control, which is both like a
Please.
mindset and I don't know, I always have counseled people. It made sense to me is that, it's really important to be wearing your headphones for technical reasons. But for me, when I'm wearing my headphones, and I prefer the kind of headphones you have on now, it's like putting on a uniform that allows me to be a little bolder, a little more intrusive, a little less me-ish, like the persona that Adam mentioned. And so I think there's some way for you to think of like stepping into that role. And I think one way that helps you then is that, like we say, if you were doing an interview in which you had a microphone between you, never let the other person take control of the mic. And
Yes.
that's partly just because who knows what'll happen. First off, they start talking, like their mic goes away, it doesn't sound good, or they have like rings, they don't even know that like things are hitting there. So that's like bad. But it's also like, I think you want to just like let them know that you know what you're doing. And you just want to say that, because I always think like, if you've given someone the comfort of like you've confident that you've got a plan, my joke is always like they literally like hang upside down in a tree with you if you said that's what it took to do a good interview. So like you want to kind of just have that, exude that confidence, even if you're super nervous. But because people are so, once they've agreed to do an interview, they really want it to go well too. And I just feel like you've got that buy-in already, not always for politicians, but for most human beings, And so I think like let yourself feel that presence. And how for me, it's putting on my headphones. I highly recommend as a twofer because you got to do it technically anyway, and it will also make you feel a little more like I'm the boss.
I love that. That is great. I never really gave any thought to the headphones as your uniform, but it's true. And I also just sort of, you don't realize how much you take for granted. Never give up the mic. Don't let somebody else take it, because there are people who will not give it back. They will talk forever, and you don't want that to happen. And it shifts the power dynamics, which you really want to stay in control of. So don't ever hand somebody the mic. It's a really common thing to do because we're trained to be polite. And politeness often gets in the way. We can be polite without using all of the conventions of politeness. Another way to maintain control of the interview is you get to some sensitive place with somebody's story and they take a pause. You've asked a hard question. They take a pause because they're not sure, do I want to share this with you? Can I go there? They're getting emotional. A polite person in normal conversation will jump in and change the subject and fill in the silence. Don't fill in the silence. That's where you're going to get the good stuff. Be willing to sit with it. Okay. So here's Terry Gross. And there's a nice little clip here about the fact that she creates a narrative structure for her questions. I used to run a daily public affairs and culture show at a public radio station here in Colorado, and we researched and spent a lot of time crafting our what's called a billboard or the introduction and our questions. It's not random at all. And you want to build up an arc to your most important questions. If you think about a climax to an interview, it's going to, or a climax to a story, it's going to come just before the resolution, just before the end. And you're working up to that. So here's just a little something that Terry says.
Do you have a plan for your interviews when you're doing them? Do you imagine what the narrative is or what the structure is, the
Absolutely.
discursive structure?
Yes.
How often does that go according to plan?
It usually goes at least partially according to plan. I want the interview to be a narrative and not a questionnaire. So I always try to figure out, where should this start? What's the right entry place for this interview? And my job in the morning when I'm in the shower is to figure out, where is this interview starting? And then if I can figure that out before the shower's through, I'll start figuring out the rest of it. But starting to me is always really important, because if you start in the wrong place, it's going to be really hard to fight your way back to where you ought to be. And also, I wanted to get off to a good start so that, the listener will be drawn in. And so you have to start in a place that doesn't assume a lot of knowledge about the person or the work or the subject. But yet it has to be in a place that's interesting enough that people will want to stay there. You want to start with maybe an overview, but not so big an overview that somebody feels like they have to tell you everything in that one answer. So it has to be like enough of a appetizer as opposed to like, a big main course kind of thing.
All right. Reactions. What do you think? Is this something that you've given much thought to? Anybody?
Yeah, I find this is actually one of the hardest things, is like, what's the right place to start a conversation? Both so that and I appreciated what Terry was saying there in terms of, you don't want to assume too much prior knowledge of the guest or subject area, but like, you can't be so broad that we don't know where we're going as a listener, and then also not so drilled in that it's not interesting to a casual audience member, right? And yeah, I don't know. So I totally struggle with this too, because it's like, what's an interesting question that's going to keep people listening, but gives you enough to say, I want to learn more, but you haven't either given everything away or been like, so tell me about the new book that you wrote. It's not some like lame question.
Right. And this is where knowing the purpose of your interview, and if it's part of a whole show, can really make a difference, I think. So let's take a show that's been on the air for a really long time, and it's very soft, right? It's not hard journalism. It's called The Good Life Project. Anybody heard that? And so Jonathan Fields, his question that he wants to know from absolutely everybody, and he ends his episodes with this, is, what do you feel it takes to have a good life? It's something like that. And so he's angling all of his questions in that direction. Maybe your show is a true crime show, or your show is a copywriting show. Like you're first of all, that's already like carving up some guardrails, right? Adam, I don't unfortunately know your show, but I know it's about anthropology. Does that give you any guardrails that make you go, well, I can always start with this particular question? Or I know what I want to get out of any particular interview.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, a super short thing is like, how do we, like, basically the show or my show is around kind of how do we talk about the humanity's creative potential? And so it's like, if they're coming because they're talking about a new book or a business venture they did, or some study they did, I know there's always that angle to kind of think about, like, what you're doing, your work do, like, help us kind of think about what we can do as people, to make the world a better place. And so oftentimes that's like, it's interesting because that's actually one of the criteria I use to decide if I should interview them in the first place. Do I kind of see a value and a positive aspect of their work that would be like good sharing with the audience? It's funny because I don't always translate that to my first question though. Because it feels like a little bit deeper, into a conversation, but I don't know. Now I'm like, maybe I should start with that question up front.
Possibly. The other thing that you can do, and I'd love for people to weigh in on what they have done, is that I think about like, well, why did I choose this guest in the first place? What is it that I am learning if I'm building my body of work that or that I feel is so valuable about what they have to say that my audience can learn from them? And I will do an intro sometimes after the fact to say, this is the angle that jumps out at me about this, right? And so I'm going to give them a little bit of context in the first place. But I'm going to try to do it in an interesting way as opposed to reciting their biography. Nobody cares. Don't recite biographies in an intro. Tell them what struck you, and then start with something that, like, not tell me about your book, but I was really fascinated that your book is the 10th one about the Anthropocene, for instance, or the whatever, and that you took a slightly different point of view that is this. Why did you start with that point of view? Like, find a way to introduce the book or the event or the topic in a way that the context is in your question, so that you don't have to say to somebody, tell me about your book, or why did you write a book about such and such, but what's the point of view? There's another hack that I kind of like too, and that is people who have always on shows often will have like a question that they start with all the time, and you get sort of to look forward to it. So if anybody is a fan of On Being, for years, she has started with like, well, what was the spiritual formation of your childhood? In other words, what was your family life like? But what was your family life like in regards to religion? And people will always tell stories about that. And it's a great way for her to get into her particular topic with them. There's a fun indie podcast. I'm a huge reader that I kind of like, which is a show called Currently Read. No, I'm sorry. What should I read next? And she always starts with, her guests are just normal, average people who are big readers, right? And she always starts with, tell me about your reading life. And she'll say, our listeners, my listeners want to know who you are as a reader. Like, what does that look like? So there might be a standard question that you can come up with that is always going to introduce the guest in a way that connects very specifically to what you know about your listeners, right? And it's an immediate way of saying, I'm going to establish relevance without stating that overtly. It's going to be a good test for you as you go into, should I choose this person or not? What's their answer going to be like to this basic fundamental interest that my listeners have? And it's nice to have a crutch. There's nothing wrong with having a crutch. Anybody else have a good way to deal with what's your opening question? How do you start?
I just like to ask a question about that, but I assume you need to do a lot of research to know your subject before you can even get to that place.
Yes.
And I'm now realizing that I always start with the basic, so tell me, who you are and how that sort of what do you do for a living kind of boring question, because perhaps I haven't done enough research to ask the more interesting question. And what also occurred to me is what you're describing as, just sort of, there's a term in copywriting and in storytelling, we call it the battlefield principle. And it's like, start your email or whatever you're going to write in the heart of the story. You drop your little soldier into the heart of the action. He's got his parachute on his back and he lands in this middle of a fight scene. That's where you start the story. And that's what you're saying. That's start the podcast at the interesting bit. And then you can work back to, well, how did you get here? And what do you do for a living? Whatever it is. So yeah, that's just the penny sort of dropping as we speak through this.
Yeah, the battlefield concept, is that what it's called? The battlefield
principle.
Yes, which is a much nicer way and more memorable way of saying in media res, right? We start the story in the middle of the action. So I'm thinking, like, let's say, for example, that somebody's written a book about the coming the coming epidemic, right? In fact, I edited a book called something like The End of Epidemics quite some time ago, and you made me think of it just now, Adam. So if I were going to interview that author, I might start with, you wrote a book that says we are absolutely going to have an epidemic within the next 10 years. Tell me why you believe that with 100% of your being, you know, so strongly that you wrote this book. He wrote it actually before the pandemic, he was right. But at a time when people still didn't believe that. So yeah, I love that principle. Anybody else on that before I move on? Okay, great. Okay, it is your interview. Now, there is almost no one who I would say embodies this more than this woman, Celeste Headley. Celeste Headley is a longtime NPR anchor, fill-in host. She did a very popular TED Talk about like 10 ways to hold better conversations that she had learned from being a journalist. I think it's been seen like 30 million times or something. And I interviewed her. She is not everybody's cup of tea because she is tough. So one of the things that we were going to get to is why and how to interrupt people. So one of the most common problems that people talk to me about is I asked a question and they just wouldn't stop talking. Or you get a politician or somebody else who's got talking points and you cannot, they're going to give you a speech. It's death, right? So what you can do, and Celeste and I talked about this, is that you can sort of prepare people for that in your housekeeping up front before you start the interview, to say, you know, this is how long this interview is going to be. Let's say it's live, right? This is how long it's going to be. This is where I'm going to lead you. If you start seeing me do this, that means wrap up your remarks. If it gets really close to the end of our time, I might give you a countdown. That's for people who, that's when you're live. But what you can also add is, I want to make this interview the absolute best it can be for the audience. And so in service of the audience, there may be times when I cut you off. I might interrupt you. I might redirect the conversation. And that's really good for you, because if the audience has a great experience, they're going to love you. And so you're sort of shifting the frame from what we normally feel when somebody cuts us off, which is how rude that was. I feel dismissed, disrespected, to, oh, you're doing this for me. Isn't that nice? That can actually help. Now, that said, there's also the interviewee. She had a show, which I believe has been canceled by Slate, that was, the premise of it was she was going to interview people with whom she disagreed. So she's already going into, but she wanted to have civil conversations. And so that meant she needed to really talk about research. She needed to know that topic, 6 ways from Sunday. Now, she's been a journalist for years, so she knows she's got a lot of body of work knowledge built up anyway. But here's where she did interrupt somebody to challenge what she felt was untruths. And here we go.
And what happened in Quebec was what happens here, namely sorting of people. I mean,
but Quebec didn't secede.
No, it didn't. It came within 1 percentage point of seceding, of voting to secede, I should say. Right? The vote.
I mean, but that's an important distinction. You're talking, the precedent that happened in Quebec did not result in secession, and the violence of the Civil War didn't begin at Fort Sumter.
Yeah.
There were skirmishes, possibly.
Okay, well, I think that must have been where I cut it off. But the point is that she held out.
What happened in Quebec was what happens here.
She held out for a long time. She was interviewing somebody who was using a proposal for Quebec to secede from Canada as an argument that the South should right now, like I think it was 2023, secede from America, and that everything would be fine. And so she gave him a lot of latitude to talk about his theories. They had a civil conversation, but when she felt that he was treading on an untruth. He's basing his entire argument on the secession of Quebec from Canada, but in fact, it didn't secede. She's serving the listener, and she's maintaining control by stepping in. So this is for more, challenging conversations, but I just want to, give you some thoughts about interrupting. Does anybody have any reaction to either one of those things about like preparing somebody you might interrupt them or redirect them? Here's a way you can do that, by the way, which is really nice, which is somebody's going on and you say, oh, that is really fascinating. And I would love to go, really talk about that at length at some point in time. But right now I want to get to this topic, right? So you can gently move away from somebody who's rambling. That or the more challenging interruptions. What's a reaction? Or a question? Do you have trouble with this?
I had a question. So I was wondering when interviewers should act as mediators. When should that happen?
How do you mean? What do you mean by mediator?
Sometimes I think when I interview people, I mediate a conversation between the person and what I want to accomplish with my article, but I'm wondering when interviewers should act as mediators in a conversation versus when they should act as interrupters, like we've been talking about. Like, how do you gauge what to do?
Can you give me an example? I'm not quite sure how you're using the word mediate between the source and the article that you're writing.
Yeah. Maybe it's not super clear. Maybe I'm just wondering, like, how do you know when to interrupt? Like,
right? How do you know when to interrupt? Yeah. Well, if you know what you're looking for and you're writing an article, give me an example of an article that you've written recently that you needed to interview somebody for.
I've written an article on why we should support the recently released incarcerated individuals in college campuses.
Okay. So it's a controversial topic, right? And were you writing an op-ed, or were you, trying to present all sides, or what were you doing?
I was trying to present all sides.
Okay. So you're exploring the topic and you're trying to get information about the pros and cons and how it works and that kind of stuff. I think you interrupt when, in that instance, you interrupt when someone's going on at length about something that you know already is irrelevant. You only have a particular amount of time and you want to make sure that you get to particularly important questions. Then I would politely interrupt and say, that's really interesting, and maybe I'll come back to it in a second article. But right now, I really need to know this. Can we talk about that?
Okay.
So it's again, interrupting is really tough because we're taught all our lives not to do it, but you really have to. Okay, so the next thing is knowing your audience. It's very helpful to know as much about your audience as you can, and it's something that most of us don't do very well, myself included. You can even do it with, just talk to individuals every month. Pick, if you have a podcast or you have readers of a newsletter, pick 4 or 5 people, write to them and say, can I just talk to you for 15 minutes about what you do? Or in my newsletter, when someone subscribes, there's a welcome email that says, write to me and tell me what you do and what your challenges are. And every time somebody does, and increasingly they do, I learn a lot more about like what's facing them, or what they're interested in, or why they came to this. If you can only guess, then, you've got at least a mission, right? So for instance, in this particular, I had spoken with a woman who was a co-host of something called the Pulso podcast. So the Pulso podcast serves a Latino audience, or it did, I'm not sure if it's still on, in the US, right? So she is herself Latino. So she had done a memoir piece, a very personal piece about her pregnancy loss. But she looked at it through the framework of what she knew about the way the Latino community views pregnancy, childbirth, pregnancy loss. And there's a lot of shame and guilt around it. And so that's the framing that she used when she was interviewing certain people for this story. It wasn't just a generic story. And so the more you know about who is this for, how are we serving them, so I'd love to hear from somebody else who we've heard from Adam, Ella, Maddie. Somebody else wanted to say, like, who's your audience? Just pop in. Julie, Ann, Audrey, your science writing.
I'm trying to figure out who my audience is. I'm in the process of starting a podcast, and so we're just in our early stages. But I'm trying to figure out who my audience is. I suspect it is Black women who are looking to transform the spaces that they're in, primarily work and community.
Okay. And so, it's what I might do. Very briefly, this is sort of a long conversation. It's hard when you're first starting, but you do need to identify who that ideal listener is. And the more specific, the better, because it's very difficult to compete. And also, it governs how you do your stories, how you do your interviews, who you choose. Is to go out and talk with people who you think might fit the parameters that you're imagining. And obviously, you're going to have a goal. If you're doing it for business or an organization, you've got a goal for the podcast or the article or whatever you're writing to reach a particular kind of person for a particular reason. And I like to frame it as two goals. One is the goal for yourself. Oh, well, I'm going to, promote my business in a gentle way. And one is for that audience member. I'm going to serve them in such and such a way. This is going to be a reason why what I am creating is a must listen. It's indispensable to them. And if you don't do that, they have so many other choices, And, we could go on. The other thing when you're doing an interview, and this actually has something to do with who you choose to interview also, is relevant. And we're going to get a little bit to it more in a minute, but why does the story that you're telling or that you're going to tell through this interview matter to this audience member? And why does it matter right now? Right? So the election results are out today. Our world is different today. There are things that are relevant today to people that were not as relevant yesterday, and vice versa. Right? So you want to be thinking about that. Very quickly, what you are producing is going to change who you're going to interview and the circumstances under which you're going to interview them and why. And what you're after. It's sort of an obvious thing here, but I just wanted to introduce that because we're all doing different things. How do you choose the person you're going to interview as a source or a guest? And I assume everybody knows the difference between a source and a guest. Source is, you're interviewing them for a story. You're going to use clips in a podcast, or you're going to use quotes in an interview. You're going to weave it together with narration. An interview, a guest is, we're going to hear by and large the bulk of this conversation. You might edit it, you might narrate it a little bit, but you're hearing a Q&A a la Terry Gross, for instance. And so I guess I have about 4 general rules that you can use to test. Like, all right, I'm going to do an episode on I don't know, pick something. I just saw a headline that says pot is getting so incredibly strong that it's driving more and more people to ERs, right? Just smoking marijuana. So I'm going to do an interview with somebody about that. So I might choose somebody who caused something to happen. Maybe there's a researcher who has caused has done some research that's leading to a better antidote. So they've made something happen. I might interview somebody who's affected by it. Somebody who's been to the ER because of pot smoking. They're an expert on a trend. or they're representative of a trend. Yeah, I mean, in this case, affected by it and representative of a trend, I chose the same person, but maybe affected by it is, you know, the people who do the budget for the ER in a particular neighborhood, and all of a sudden it's blown up because they didn't anticipate that their number of patients is doubling, right? So you can use those kinds of things to test relevance, and always remember timing, right? Auditioning your subjects, and this is where we get into pre-interviews. Has anybody done pre-interviews? Yeah, Laurie, tell us about a pre-interview that you did recently. What'd you do?
Yeah, I pre-interviewed experts. I've just recently finished 10 episodes, and we are pre-launch, so they're not out yet. But yeah, some of the people, especially the people that have a YouTube channel and they're an expert, but they're not necessarily, like, I'm not finding them on a lot of podcasts. They're an expert when they're speaking themselves to their own camera with their own edit. But I got a little bit burned by that with one of my earliest episodes. So I felt like now it's imperative, if I find somebody who is, they're exactly who I want to talk to, but I am not finding them in a lot of interviews out there. I am doing pre-interviews for them just to make sure that what's the pace, what's the vibe, can they riff, can they be casual, or like, what is their flow if it's not their own channel or their own experience. I learned that the hard way.
Yes, yeah, we tend to learn this the hard way. Pre-interviews help immensely for a couple of things. Obviously you want them to be relevant to your subject at hand. You want to make sure that they have evidence for what they're saying, that they are expert on. Well, how do you know this? Like, are you a researcher? Were you in this, did you go through the event that we're talking about? Whatever, there's got to be some evidence for what they are saying being true. So there's the topic at hand, but then there's also, what we call in public radio being a good talker, which is sort of what Laurie is talking about. Can they hold a conversation? Can they tell a story? Do they come prepared perhaps with an anecdote, a beginning, middle, and end that illustrates what you're talking about, so that it's not all just facts and data? It's boring. You want to make sure that they don't introduce or exacerbate bias or disinformation. And if you are, like Laurie is, planning a lot of episodes at once, it's pretty helpful to be thinking about your guests across a season or a series. If you can, none of these rules apply to everything, but making sure that you have a diverse cast of characters, if you will, within the demographics that you've selected, right? So Carrie is talking to Black women. So you're not going to go interview white women, presumably, right? Because they don't fit your show. But you might have different ages, or you might have different geographies. They're in different parts of the country or the world. You might have different educational levels or occupations. It just depends on what you're doing. So I like to think about that over the course of time. Does anybody know who that picture is of? That is Mike Ross, the character Mike Ross from Suits. So he's a lawyer, and they're always showing him, up at 3 o'clock in the morning in the law library preparing. And I do think that lack of prep is the most common problem that we have in this, at least in the podcast industry. But it's actually gotten worse in most journalism because of the need for speed. It's like, what do you sacrifice when you have to be first? So a lot of this we've talked about, but Ella, I think, really touched on it. It's like, oh, if I have to say, well, tell me about yourself, or introduce yourself, or tell me about your job in a such general way, it probably is an indicator that I have not done my research, and I don't have purpose, and I haven't perhaps scripted my questions in a way that I know what I want to get from this person. It is particularly important, and I know I keep harping on this, but fact checking has gone out the window, and it is just particularly important that we know the facts of a matter before we allow somebody our airtime, because we can lead people astray really, really, really easily by mistake or on purpose. Carrie, what do you have to add? And I mean, I know I'm speeding through this. We could do an entire seminar on pre-interviews and on prep.
I don't think I have a lot to add, Elaine. I think you covered a lot of it. I mean, I kind of combine the prep with that interview structure, and if you've listened to other interviews, you can usually get it and or done a pre-interview, get a sense of where they might get stuck or things that they've said too often. I don't know if that like it's the fact checking I totally agree with. And it can be really hard to do it in the moment, especially if you're going to end up like saying that somebody's not saying the truth. I mean, I think you've seen this in like the general media in interviewing Trump, it's like there's been more of a push to hold him accountable, but to things he's saying that have no factual basis, but it's still really hard to do conversationally. So I just want to like acknowledge that as it's a tricky thing. But the preparation is like I was working on a podcast where I had to do a lot of prep, and it's like I would watch everything, listen to everything, like write all my questions, like rewrite them, like figure out a host intro, and then figure out how it should start, and just like that figuring out that all of that before I even got. And I worked with a host, so then I had to put all of that work through a host to get to the guest. It's
Right.
yeah, complicated.
Yes, it is. It is indeed. Thanks, Carrie. And you mentioned something that went into my head and then went right back out again, but it's going to come back to me. I think,
Maybe
oh,
the
and that
role
is,
of a producer. Sorry, I don't know if that was it.
yeah, no, that we're going to get to the role of producer absolutely in just a second, or a few minutes. If you do a lot of prep, you will find that there are people who say the same things on a bunch of shows or in a bunch of articles. They're always saying the same thing. Don't ask them about that, or ask them something different about that, but get them, you're not serving anybody, least of all yourself, if you just go out and let them talk about what they always talk about, right? Which can be really difficult. It's one of the reasons not to interview celebrities, because by very definition, they have to do that. This is a little bit about narrative transportation. Has anybody ever heard this term? So narrative transportation is the researchy scientific term for what we would call in public radio driveway moments. And a driveway moment in public radio, you don't hear that term as much anymore, but it used to be that the story was so immersive, you were so caught up in it, you had to find out what happened, that you would, you're commuting, you get home, you sit in your driveway, and you have to sit there and listen to the end of it before you go in the house. So narrative transportation, our brains and our bodies literally neurologically feel like we are there. There's a guy named Paul Zak. He's done fascinating research about this. It's ZAK. We might sweat, our heart rate might speed up. Our job if we're doing narrative storytelling, and I believe that you can do this in a magazine article as well, any kind of actual storytelling. You can even do it in an interview if you get a great guest who's good at telling stories, or you're good at telling stories. You're putting somebody in the middle of the action, that battlefield principle. It's gripping, right? He's done research that says, we really feel like our blood pressure might go up. And so in order to do that, we can interview to get sensory details from our source. So how? So Ira Glass says, be a tour guide, right? So an event occurred. So, using, I wish I had this clip. If you go and you listen to the 13th Step episodes that I did on sound judgment, there's 2 parts. I believe it's in part 1. She does this. And she's got a source, I believe at the very beginning, who went to a treatment center for substance abuse. And she says, so you got there. What do you remember about your first day? And this woman tells this incredible story about sitting on a hill and looking up at the stars and having sort of a God moment. She's basically saying, be a tour guide. Show me what your world looked like and felt like to you, right? So you want to, when you do that, you want to encourage your source to use their senses and ask them things like, well, what really struck you, or what mattered to you? What was at stake? Employ metaphor. What did it feel like? If you had to compare this to that. And as I said before, silence is your friend. So this clip was done by a really, really good producer at Colorado Public Radio, Andrea Dukakis, who was doing a series about people who were recently released from incarceration. And she followed Kevin Montero. She spent a lot of time with him. He had been in prison for 30 years and he got out. And she said, well, tell me about that first day. Where'd you go? What did it feel like, et cetera?
Everything is out of place. You know, I know where I'm at, but everything is really like people done move the furniture around. Because when I was picturing what I was going to see, I was picturing 1984.
Montero's 5'11", about 225 pounds with a solid build. He knew things were going to look different outside of prison. He knew he'd see people walking around with cell phones and driving 21st century cars. But he didn't know freedom would feel so heavy.
The physical pressure was like I was carrying water bags, you know, like hefty trash bags just full of water, and I could not seem to walk straight. And the only way it would leave is if I had structure. In other words, somebody has to get me up. I need to be scheduled constantly.
Every day for decades, Kevin Montero had been forced to follow prison's strict schedule. And
everything is...
So do you hear the metaphor in that? I mean, it's pretty obvious, you know, it's heavy like water bags. That was undoubtedly, you know, she edited that interview. You hear her narrating. He knew it would feel different, but he didn't know how different. He probably talked to her at length about that. She may have had to ask question after question to get him to reflect on that scene of like, I'm walking to the bus stop and, you know, but it's, that kind of stuff is so powerful. We have to hear what happens to Kevin Montero next, right? Any questions about this sort of tour guide idea? So there's a book called Out on a Wire, if you're not familiar with it. Jessica Abel wrote it with the help of Ira Glass. It's a graphic, it's in graphic novel style, but it's nonfiction. And it's about radio reporting. It's very good. So you might want to take a look at that. There we go. Kelly Corrigan, very popular interviewer. Is anybody familiar with Kelly Corrigan? She has a show called Kelly Corrigan Wonders. That's the podcast. Tell Me More, I think, on PBS. And she's talking to, you know, very famous people for the for the most part. And so she's got all these sort of questions where she's always trying to elicit a story. She says she knows that an interview has gone well when somebody tells her something that they haven't told anybody else. And she knows this because she's listened to all the interviews and read all this stuff. And, you know, she's very familiar before she ever goes. And she's got a producer who is helping with all this research and helping to often writing the questions, that narrative arc. Carrie wanted me to touch on the role of a producer, and I will get to that, I promise. So she knows all this stuff. So when she can elicit something that has not been heard somewhere else, that's when she knows, I've actually done it. And I have an episode with her on Sound Judgment, and she goes into that at some length.
50 guys on death row
have
his cell phone number.
She's talking to Brian Stevenson, who wrote a book called Just Mercy. He is like the guy in America who represents people on death row and is an activist against the death penalty.
That's who they call. He's like their family. He's their brother. He's their priest. He's their father. He's their son, if they're really old. So you think about what it would feel like to be carrying 150 people's fate. And then you think about how much you would need to play piano. Like to step away from all that and to make something beautiful and to be alone inside like a cloud of music. And it just was, to me, it was like this incredible unlock of these two disparate pieces of information that to me seems so related.
So what did you do?
I went right there. I brought it right up with him. And then, amazingly, on the set where we were shooting, there was a baby grand piano. And between shots, he went over. And I was like, would you like to play piano? Like, would that be relaxing for you? And he's like, I would love to. So then he's playing the piano. Then all the cameramen are like, turning towards him. And so it's actually a beautiful part of the episode is when I'm asking him about it, we cut to the B-roll of him playing piano on a break.
When I play the piano, it's the one thing that takes me out of my head. It's just fully engaging. So I love being kind of just step out of my life into this world of music. And I'm curious about every piano.
So obviously she knew ahead of time because she'd done her research that he was a piano player. It was not something that people had ever talked about. She got lucky. She didn't know the grand piano was on her PBS set, but it does raise something that came up at the recent Resonate conference, which is interviewing is a physical thing. And you want to sort of, get in touch with what are you feeling in your body. And if you have the opportunity, try to do some stuff in person. Go for a walk with somebody. Look at, walk in the same direction. Sometimes people are more comfortable side by side. Do something physical. Ask them to do something physical. If you notice something in their environment, even on a Zoom call, ask them about something physical. I did that with Ronald Young. He had a keyboard behind him, so I asked him about it. He wound up telling me a whole story about the role that music played in the Black church growing up for him, and he started to sing on the interview. I had no idea that was going to happen, but and you can feel too, I'm sure some of you have felt this where you go, oh, that quote is great. I'm going to use that quote. It may sound a little hokey or a little woo-woo, but use your body, use the presence, the knowledge that your body has. Here, the questions on number 8, elicit stories. Everybody's going to get this deck. So if you haven't written them down, they're just useful questions. A little bit about profiles in documentary. Does anybody do this kind of work? Here, is anybody interested in this? Because I can skip this if I'm not seeing anybody talking about documentary. This is basically how do you get information about someone who is at the center of a documentary or an investigation or something, where you want to talk around a subject because they either won't talk to you or because you really do want that other perspective on them. I mean, Trump is like the
Sharon
obvious.
says,
Oh, sorry, I did have a clip, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. So these are, some of the obvious ones. Active curiosity, just be curious about everything all the time. Empathy, even with somebody you disagree with, because we lack complexity in our media world right now in a really serious way. And my example of this is always, we have a climate change problem. A lot of the solutions sound very drastic. Let's get rid of all cattle. Let's never eat real beef again. But if you go to, say, South Dakota, where people have been making their livings, raising cattle for decades, that scares them because then how are they going to make a living? You've got an economic problem as well as an environment problem. And so things are just not black and white. So let's use some empathy and curiosity because we don't know what's going on for other people. We can understand some context and maybe get into it that way. Like, well, what are the unintended consequences of X, right? The ability to think on your feet. I've heard a lot from people about how do you go into an interview with your questions, your purpose, but also follow the conversation where it goes. And that's a dance. That is knowing your body. It's being aware of what you want, but also not being afraid if somebody says something interesting to follow that, because, oh, wait a minute, somebody said something that I hadn't thought of. Willingness to do the hard work of preparation. Now, producer, which totally should be in this deck. If you have the luxury of having a producer, fantastic. If you do not, you can enlist a good listener. It could be a friend to just sit in on an interview with you, come with you in person, maybe. You got to be a little careful about dynamics there, but particularly on remote interviews, they don't even have to show on screen. They can just listen. And then at the end, you can say, hang on a second, I'm just going to see if my producer has any other questions for me. And they should be taking notes very carefully along the way, and even timestamps, and saying, when you asked this question, the guest really didn't answer it. Can you re-ask that question? Or they said this interesting thing and you didn't follow up. Can you follow up? Or, they mumbled, they had a really good answer to this question, but we can't really understand their word. Would you do it again? You can also use a producer, and that's probably a subject for another presentation. How do you use the producer or an associate producer in the prep and the crafting of questions in the first place? Which we don't really have time to get into, but if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I threw in a few other things in here just for the heck of it. It's helpful to understand what a story actually is. You need a character that you care about. You may not be doing literal storytelling. Stakes are always important. A conflict, an obstacle to getting what they want, and some kind of change. And the resolution has meaning. Or Glenn Washington, I think I promised this in my email inviting people to the course. Glenn Washington got mad at me when we were talking about one of his episodes of Snap Judgment. And I said, but what does that mean at the end? And he's like, Elaine, if I told you what it meant, you wouldn't think about this anymore. I want people to continue thinking about this afterwards. I want them going home to their spouse and saying, I heard this really interesting story, but I think this and I think that. So there's different opinions about whether to tie it up with a meaning or not. And it depends on what you're doing. Like, if you're doing a business podcast and you want people to remember what you told them, at the end, you're going to say, well, here are the 5 lessons that I heard from so-and-so guest today that I want you to remember and go home and use. That's a totally different ballgame. Some backbone questions. One driving question for an episode. What is the good life for this actor, right? What do we know now about treating, substance abuse with very powerful weed that we didn't know before? What is the journey you're taking a listener on? That's more a little bit for narrative, like, Kevin Montero. We followed this character. He's our quote unquote story mule. A character is going to take us through an issue, and he's taking us. We want to know his journey, and we're going to go on that journey with you. And then how does that protagonist change over time? If you've got somebody at the center of your story who doesn't change over time, that may not be the right person to have at the center of your story. I will be sending this, so there's just little tips that you can use to sort of help you. And then if you like, it would be wonderful if you would just click on that 1-minute feedback form link and fill out the survey. Obviously, no obligation, but it's very helpful to me. And there's a link here to, if you haven't already signed up for the waitlist, to be informed of new workshops when I do another one. It may be a while. I'm in the process of moving, so I don't expect to do another workshop for at least a couple of months, but I do them, 3-4 times a year. And other information. So that is that. And you'll get this deck. So I am going to finally stop sharing. I see a lot of new messages in the chat. Singing is the best. I love it. Yeah. We have a few minutes, and I'm certainly willing to stay on for another 5 minutes, although I know that a 2-hour webinar is really long. What kind of questions do you guys have? Or reactions? Something that resonated with you, something you disagree with? Christina.
I'm trying to put it into words, but I have a podcast that I'm going to launch and it's on grief. So
Okay.
it'll be part my story, part interviewing others and their stories, but also part kind of well-being and how to take care of yourself. And so interviewing experts in that,
Mm-hmm.
and also maybe having life insurance, these type of things.
Oh,
So how do I, like, preparing for this type of thing? So how do I bring in story when I am talking to somebody, say, about life insurance, or how do I hook the emotion into it?
right. Always, always, always ask for examples. You know, it's the simplest way to get people to tell you a story. So, you know, somebody's talking about life insurance and they say, well, you know, so and so a new product will, you know, keep the monthly premiums down, but there's a $10,000 deductible, and this is why I don't recommend it. And so you can say, well, give me an example. Like, that sounds okay to me. I'm a young person. I don't really expect to need this in a long time for a long time. I'm just doing it as a matter of course. Why does that matter? Give me an example. You know, or you can even just say, tell me a story of somebody who had a $10,000 deductible. What happened to them? You know, and if somebody doesn't have a good story about it, maybe you don't even use that, because they can get, you want to be careful about giving people information on a podcast in particular that they can get somewhere else, or that is very difficult to listen to because we don't rewind the tape. Is this something that's better to read than to listen to? Put it in tips on your website and say at the end, for practical information on how to deal with thus and such, go to my website where there's a blog post and all the data and some links, right? So be careful about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Be careful with numbers and data on a podcast. We don't hear numbers and data very well. Use them very sparingly. It's not something we can read and go back to.
Okay.
Anybody else? That's a good question. Anything that you might change as a result of something that you heard in this sort of massive presentation here? Ella.
One thing that I was curious about, going for a walk and getting out and physical with your podcast guests. I tend to do all mine online, but I'd love to do in-person podcasts. But that just begged the question, well, what equipment would I need to actually record a podcast out on a walk? You know, can you do it with a phone and a simple clip-on microphone, you know, or do you need something more fancy?
You know, there's lots and lots of information about this and a lot of differing opinions about it. Yeah, you can. One thing that you want to be careful of is if you go for a walk outside, make sure that you also record the outside sounds without anybody talking. It's called ambient sound, and make sure you get plenty of it, like a good minute of it, because otherwise you can't edit and you'll hear that. And it's really awful. So make sure you do that. Also get room tone. Let's say you're sitting in person with somebody in a room. Oh, good. Thank you. I love these good examples, Carrie. This is great. So look in the chat, guys. She's putting in a lot of nice links to things.
Yeah, so you
get
can
room
edit out
tone, get room
the
tone as well,
background.
right? Because most
Yeah.
rooms do have some tone. If I were going to be talking to somebody here, I would want to make sure that I just said, don't talk for a minute and just record that room tone so that I've got it for underneath. As far as the equipment itself, transom.org is a good place to go to look for stories for articles about equipment. There's way too much to talk about about that in like 2 minutes, but I don't know, Carrie, do you want to add anything to that?
Nope, just definitely Transom. They just did a new article about these really tiny Zoom recorders, which could be really lovely for going out in the field. But it's kind of it's a whole thing, right? You know, that's a whole other skill to learn. It's easy, doable, but it's like a little different than in some ways this.
I think I might have that little tiny Zoom recorder, and I can't think of the model number, but it literally plugs into my iPhone, and it's about so big. And it's good. It's not as good as, you know, a real a real recorder and mic, but it's pretty darn good. Somebody is asking, Carrie is asking, will the recording be available? Yes, the replay will be sent to everybody and the deck. And also I'll send a few other resources as well. I'll try to compile the links that Carrie so nicely gave me. That was really helpful. Oh, there you go. So she just put a link to that Zoom F2, F3 recorder. I think that's actually different than the one I'm thinking of. So more and more stuff is coming out that works with phones or is really tiny for that purpose. Very difficult to lug around big stuff, especially, you know, if you're not doing it all the time. Anybody else?
I've got one.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you are planning for, I've listened to a lot of your podcast. Do you feel like you're planning for narrative transportation? Like, are you thinking what in advance, like what you think is going to have that meaning? You know, are you attempting to even plan for that in advance and say like, okay, these things could be poignant, like try to push your guests for like to have a moment, or is that just something that you generally feel like happens as it happens if you're lucky?
I think it's a combination, and I think it depends on what you're doing. So sound judgment is very much about how to explainer kind of podcast. So I'm not really building a world. The people I'm interviewing have, in many cases, built a world. And so I might, you know, have a clip about that or talk about what they did. But you know, if I were going to be doing, I'm working on a story about an ag company that's done a lot of things wrong. And so it's in a very rural area. There's a lot of stuff. I can just hear it right now. You'll notice too, when is a good story? When you can start to hear it in your head, or a good interview, you start to hear it ahead of time. Like, oh, I can hear how that would go. And then I might plan for that, you know, but it's not so much that I'm trying to manipulate the listener as that I really want to enter into that world with them. And so I think if you really think, well, I want to know what that looked like, felt like, smelled like, sounded like, you know, touched, and you ask those questions, people love to actually answer questions like that because nobody talks to us like this. Most people are not that curious about us. And so when you give somebody that kind of attention, a lot of times they really like it and they will tell you a story, but you just have to prompt them. So it's more of that for me. Carrie, what is it for you? Do you plan for that narrative transportation, that driveway moment, or is it just out of a sense of, you know, we're so used to asking for stories, right? And
Yeah.
scenes. It's interviewing for scenes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, you know, I think it's good to have a wish list, you know, to like sort of imagine a scenario in which you get into that. So you can like kind of get yourself, if you see the opening, that you can go for it, you know? And, you know, since we do edit and post too, you can like, you know, back up a little bit. And like when you hear the start of something and say like, hey, like, you know, I think that was great, but I'm not sure I totally understood it. Can you go back to the beginning and explain it to me? And then fix it a little bit, you know, or restructure it. Editing your interviews is a whole other thing, but, you know, we sort of take a moral compass and that we don't change a speaker's intent. But other than that, we can like do anything essentially so that it is clear for the listener. So you can construct those moments a little bit too, even if they don't come out perfectly. But if you hear the beats, you could consolidate them. But it's always those little moments, so like it's like a little tingly where you go like, oh, there's something good there, and like you just have to like kind of know that in your gut, and then go like, all right, I'm going in, like whatever it is. So,
yeah. Trust yourself. If you have an emotional reaction to something, you think it's really funny, or you think it's really sad, or you're like really curious. Trust yourself. You know, you're the expert on your reaction to things, right? And lean into that. Keep in mind too, what Carrie just mentioned is that most of us we're not that great at chronology. And we're also awful at pronouns. And so we'll say, hey, you know, a girlfriend, like, let me tell you about this date that I have the other night, what he told me. And he told me that he went to the office and that she did this and that he did that. And then she did this and then she did that. And all of a sudden you're like, which she are you talking about? Well, people do that all the time. So just break in and say, help me understand here. I'm not really sure. Can you do that again? You know, but use names and take me to it. You know, like you may have to ask people 3 and 4 times to tell a complicated story if it's complicated, so that you really understand it. You may reconstruct that, you know, sort of the way Andrea did in that one about the incarcerated man who just got out of prison, to say, you know, he knew it was going to feel really different, but he didn't know how. That was a succinct way, I'm sure, of boiling down a lot of stuff that he told her, but that the listener would be bored silly by if they heard all of it. Like they can't make sense of it. That's sort of our job. It's a great question. Well, we are at time. Thanks for being here for 2 whole hours and on this particular day too. We love emotions, Carrie says. Carrie, thank you for informally being my co-host and helping me with the tech. That was challenging because I didn't expect that change. I guess I should have been on top of that. And thank you all for being here. And I hope that I will see you again at some point. Feel free to reach out, you know, if something, you know, came up for you and you've got a question you didn't want to answer, you didn't want to ask here, then by all means, you know, just send me an email and I will answer that. So thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. It's brilliant.